Hello and welcome to this tutorial on the topic of the Ad-Hoc query available from the Device Explorer, which can be used within multiple Gluware applications. If you're taking the test drive, you'll be able to follow along with the steps shown in this session. Ad-Hoc query is a new feature introduced in Gluware 4.0, which helps to automate network operations procedures, primarily related to troubleshooting, but they're also very useful when performing various types of assessments as you work to automate additional components of your infrastructure, like moving towards config management automation. So in this tutorial, we're going to look at using the ad-hoc query to perform configuration searches as well as operational state searches. So let's go ahead and get signed into Gluware. Again, when I sign into Gluware, it's going to take me back into the last application that I was in. You can navigate your applications with the application switcher here. I am going to execute this from Device Manager. However, as mentioned, and if you saw the previous video on Device Explorer, the ad hoc query function is available from the other apps, including Config Drift and Audit and OS Manager. So let's stay inside Device Manager here for the purposes of this tutorial. So the first step in running an ad hoc query is selecting the devices that you want to run the query on. So you can either dive right into, handpicking the ones you see from the grid, or as previously shown, you can use grouping, filtering, searching, sorting to narrow it down to the devices that you want to work with. For my demonstration purposes here, I'm going to keep it simple and just select the Cisco CSRs. So I highlight, do a shift select, I can do a control A for all, I can do shift select, various mechanisms to kind of highlight or select these devices, but I'm going to go ahead and select these 6 devices. And then on my actions view over here, you see the new icon, which is the magnifier over the camera kind of icon here, and that's the ad hoc query. So you want to click on that, and that's going to bring your dialog into view on the top. So it's a pretty simple dialog. You have the name of your query, and if you're just jumping into it for the first time, it'll be named new query. Once you define and run a query, you can save it. We'll take a look at that. When you think of what you're querying, you can query really 2 categories of things: configuration files, or you can tell the Gluware engine to go connect to the devices and query the device themselves. Because, as already covered in previous tutorials, when Gluware performs a discovery like we've already done here, we do have the configuration data already in the system, and that generally you're going to want to work with the latest snapshot. If you are using or comparing information to the default snapshot is defined within Config Drift and Audit. Within that application, you can define what is known as a default snapshot. That is kind of your expected state of the configuration, and you'll be using Drift to see if the current configuration has drifted away from what you've deemed to be the default. But anyway, for the purpose of this demonstration and tutorial, we will be focused on using the latest snapshot for those searches. So in this case here, we're going to be searching the latest snapshot, which is the full configuration. And then the filter here, the filter is none. It's the full configuration. And that's really the only filter that would apply when you think of the config file. There's no kind of filtering you can do. And the concept item is grayed out here because we'll get to that in an upcoming component. But a concept item is something Gluware understands a configuration component and can look at a segment of the configuration versus looking at the full config file. So we'll get to that. So let's move on to what the query actually is. So in a previous example, I was showing or talking about looking at devices that were configured for BGP. So let's take that example into here. These are all Cisco IOS based devices. So let's use the string router BGP. And this query field here does fully support regex, by the way. But let's just go ahead and use clear text because you can find this directly within a configuration and use the phrase router BGP. And when I move down to run the query, the devices that I had already selected are my so-called target devices. These are the devices. In this case, Gluware is going to use the database that we have stored the configuration for these, but these are the ones that the query is going to run on. You could edit the target devices, and you can add or remove devices from your overall inventory. I'm going to just stick with the devices that I've already pre-selected. But it's very important to know you do have to pre-select some devices to even be able to open up this dialog. Once you're here, you can tune this selection if you want. I'm going to run the query on all these devices, so I'm going to hit Run Query. So it runs very fast because these are already in the Gluware database. So I can see that I have 4 hits and I have 2 that do not have configuration. And one very useful thing here is, let's take a look at spoke 4 here. In the action view, I can click in to see exactly what happened, and I can see, Gluware use this configuration file, and this number 1 is the number of times router BGP was found. So if I click the arrow key here, and this is kind of a similar dialog you're going to see within config drift and audit, it's going to show me where that instance occurred. So unlike config search that I showed you down here, where you're searching and narrowing, kind of filtering the devices by it, then you'd have to go into the config and find it. When you use Ad-Hoc query, it will identify the exact string and where it's located in the configuration. So I'd say that would be a benefit of maybe you're using config search to narrow down your devices, but now you want to dig into these devices. This is how you do it. Another useful component over here is that I'm looking at spoke 4 because that's what I clicked into, but I can use this drop down here to navigate the other devices here. Let's go to spoke 1. Let me jump back to details here. Let's go into spoke 3 and hit the arrow key, and you can see here, router BGP 300. So this is how I can, if I go back to my details, I can see these devices have BGP configured. These 2 do not have BGP. So if I was expecting BGP to be configured, this could be a yellow flag or a red flag or something I might want to look into from a troubleshooting standpoint. Okay, so let's take it a step further. And I know I have BGP configured, but now I want to know the operational state. So before we move off this, I can save the query I just did and call it, BGP configured iOS or something like that, and hit save. So I can rerun the queries without having to retype the information. It's quite useful, especially as you maybe don't want to always look up the syntax for the command if you don't have everything memorized. So let's go into a new query, and instead of querying the snapshot, I want to query the devices this time. And instead of looking at the configuration, I want to look at by show command. So this is quite useful, and as you go into the show command dialog, you can actually enter one or more show commands, so that this gets quite useful. But let's start pretty basic here, and let's do a command here to show IP BGP neighbor, and the query I'm going to look for is something you need to know from the output what it looks like in the output of when you run a command. But I'm going to use the syntax BGP state equals established. So I want to look at or confirm that the BGP state is in an established state for one or more neighbors. So I'm going to hit run query. So it's going to take a little longer to execute because the Gluware engine is actually interrogating each one of those devices. It's going to run the commands, process the output, and then build that for you. So it does take something like 2 minutes or so. Whatever. It all depends. Again, mileage may vary based on your setup, your environment, how many engines you have running, and there's a lot of criteria behind increasing performance of Gluware if you need to. So I can see that my spokes each have 3 matches while my hubs have none. So if I again look into spoke 4, I can see I have a neighbor which is this remote AS 100 is established. If I jump down, remote AS, okay, and So here is remote AS200, here's a remote AS300, and so on, remote AS100. So I can see here I have, three different peers that are in the established state. So I would consider that, good or expected. And again, you could glean kind of high-level results in that these are good, and that, let's say these spokes were in a full mash all BGP, peers of each other, each would have 3 peers established. So I could say this looks like a good state and potentially move on. So let's take a look at kind of the last example in this component of it, which is and again, I could save and call this, BGP neighbor state and hit save. Okay, and then again, I could rerun that easily. So let's do a new query, and let's do a device. And instead of doing show command, I'm going to do concept item. And what concept item is going to do is it leverages the Gluware library of commands, and so I'm going to put in a search string NTP, and so again I'm looking through various configuration that Gluware knows about. It's called our concept item. We'll get into that further as we get into config modeling. But let's take a look at iOS NTP agent. So this is looking at the specific NTP, and again, numerous concept items. This is just an example, and I want to look at NTP. I'm going to query it for NTP server. So I'm trying to see if NTP is configured on these devices. Instead of looking at the whole configuration, I'm going to look by concept item. It's just a way of focusing more and looking at a subset, but also querying it on the device itself. So let's go ahead and run the query. And again, when you're running anything where your source is the device itself, it will take a little longer because Gluware again is actually going down, executing the provisioning engines to get down and query those devices and then pull the data back, execute the results. So here again I can see I have my matches. When I jump into the results, because I'm using a concept item, Gluware is filtering out or looking at a very specific area of the configuration. So this is the snippet of configuration, and here I can confirm an NTP server is configured. And if I just jump back, each of these have one NTP server configured. Well, this guy has 2. So if that was unexpected, I could jump in here and go, oh, like these are not the right NTP servers, or these are old NTP servers, and I could take action to correct that. So those are the the main mechanisms of ad hoc query, and that you're either searching a config file already captured by Gluware, or you're searching the device. When you search the device, you can capture or look at the config file running on the device by using a concept item, or you can use show commands as well. So let's take it one step further here, and let me do a new query, and I'm going to do a device query, and I'm going to do by show command. And I'm going to do show run, and I'm going to do show NTP status. Just type that. Well, actually this example doesn't make a lot of sense in the sense that I would be looking for, well, let's just do it. Let's do show run and show NTP status, and because the output is slightly different. Knowing the NTP command, NTP server is how you configure it, but in the results you're going to be looking at the clock status. So let's just search for the phrase NTP. So in the running config as well as NTP status, I should have hits. So let's go ahead and run that query, and then we'll do one more variation of it to close the demo. So again, now I'm running multiple show commands, and again, it's interrogating the device. So now you can see all the hits here. When I go into the action view, what you're going to see here is it's executing that first command, which is show run. And if I look for my setting, I actually have NTP 2 hits in the configuration. I have NTP source loopback 0, and I have my NTP server. So there's my 1 and 2. Moving further, you can see in this same snippet or capture, we've also captured the operational state, show NTP status. And so I can see here, NTP, if I move down here, I got my NTP status, and NTP is up, or the clock is synchronized. So this is a way of searching a config file and an operational state potentially at the same time. But now let's refine that even further. So let's jump back to details. And now I want to just look at my show NTP status. But the phrase I want to look for is clock is synchronized. So this is a positive test of saying I expected clocks to be synchronized. Let me go ahead and validate that. And if I run the query, again, Gluware is telling it's in the provisioning engines to go down and execute. Oh, I did not get my results. Show NTP status. So when you don't get the match you would expect, you want to examine your command in your query. So I know show NTP status is the right command. If I look at this clock is synchronized, I actually notice an error here, and that has to be a lowercase I. So it is case sensitive because it's looking for an exact match in the output. So when you're running these commands or whatnot, you probably would have a terminal window open, and you'd be maybe testing the commands manually. Gluware is really the force multiplier to run it on lots of devices for you, but you want to make sure in spot checking you understand the syntax of your show command in your query and it works. And we can, as we get into config modeling, we can show you even through there with a terminal window and a regex utility how you can test this stuff all within Gluware. But for the purposes of this demo, I can spot that was a typo, and I have to have it an exact match. So I'm going to rerun the query. So right here I have, and I see every device has a match for clock is synchronized except for hub 2. So if my assignment was to you is find the device that NTP is not either configured properly or not running properly, this would be your cheat guide to go in and execute this search real quick, and I can very quickly identify hub 2 is not running properly. So if I navigate again into spoke 4, I can see show NTP status, clock is synchronized. If I jump back and I navigate into actions, I can see here NTP is configured, but the clock is not synchronized. So that tells me there's probably a configuration error. It's probably pointing at the wrong NTP server. So this concludes the ad hoc query demonstration. Hopefully you can see the benefit and the power of being able to really extend your capability as an engineer. Instead of having to go box by box and executing commands, you can leverage Gluware to perform searches on the configuration, searches on the operational state, even both at the same time, and really find, kind of, I like to say, the needle in the haystack when you're troubleshooting or looking for some issue that's affecting an operational condition. So with that, this concludes the tutorial on ad hoc query. Thanks for your time.